Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a gentle, meandering journey back to a time when GPS was just a whispered prayer to the stars, and your phone battery dying meant you were probably just lost. Really lost. Imagine, if you will, the vast, untamed American wilderness of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. You're standing at the edge of a dense forest, a scent of pine and damp earth heavy in the air. The only sound the rustle of leaves and the distant call of an unknown bird. There are no paved roads, no gas stations, certainly no roadside motels with complimentary continental breakfast. Just miles and miles of raw, unpredictable nature. And yet, into this sprawling, often unforgiving landscape, a unique figure emerged, the early American circuit rider. You're about to step into their worn boots, feeling the ache in your bones from endless days in the saddle, the chill of a damp dawn, and the quiet satisfaction of a hard journey. You probably wouldn't survive a week, let alone a lifetime, out there. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you settle in, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins not with a grand pronouncement, but with a quiet, almost spiritual yearning. In the nascent United States, as settlers pushed westward, threading their way through dense forests and across winding rivers, established towns and their comforting steeples were few and far between. This created a vast spiritual vacuum. People, isolated on their homesteads, hungered for connection, for guidance, and for a sense of belonging that traditional, stationary churches simply couldn't provide. Imagine living in a log cabin, miles from your nearest neighbor, the only sounds the wind whistling through the cracks and the distant howl of a wolf. You'd long for news, for companionship, and perhaps, most of all, for a word of comfort, a shared hymn. This widespread spiritual hunger, born of the frontier's isolation, was the primary catalyst for the rise of the circuit rider. These were men, predominantly Methodists, who felt an undeniable call to bring the message to the scattered souls beyond the reach of conventional ministry. It wasn't a choice for comfort or ease. It was a deeply felt conviction, a sense of duty that pulled them onto the trail. The training for such a life was less about seminary classrooms and more about raw resilience. You wouldn't find them poring over ancient texts in a library. Their classroom was the unforgiving wilderness itself. A young man, often in his early 20s, would typically begin as a junior preacher, riding alongside an experienced elder, learning the ropes, quite literally, as they navigated treacherous paths. They learned to identify edible plants, to build a fire in a downpour, and to find their way by the stars when the sun had long since set. This on-the-job training was brutal, but incredibly effective, weeding out those without the true grit required for the circuit. One common practice was to literally ride the circuit for a probationary period, proving you could physically endure the relentless travel before you were even considered for official designation. Historians still argue whether this rigorous physical endurance was more important than theological training in the early days. But one thing is clear: you needed both a sturdy constitution and an unshakable faith to succeed. Think about it. No fancy degrees, no sprawling campus. Your education was delivered by the constant jarring of a horse's trot, the biting wind, and the relentless sun. You learned to condense your sermons, to speak plainly, to connect with people who hadn't seen a preacher in months, maybe even years. It was a unique form of higher education, where resilience was the most important textbook and every blister was a lesson learned. You'd be taught how to handle a horse that shied at shadows, how to ford a swollen creek without losing your precious saddlebags, and how to sleep soundly with only the sounds of the forest for company. It sounds almost poetic now, doesn't it? But at the time, it was simply survival. The call was internal. The training was external, and the path was always forward. So you've answered the call, perhaps a bit naively, and now you find yourself atop a sturdy horse, heading out into the vast, whispering expanse. Your office isn't a cozy study with a roaring fire. It's a perpetually changing landscape, from winding forest trails barely wider than your horse, to muddy tracks that threaten to swallow your hooves whole. Every single day was a new leg of the journey, a constant forward motion. You're not just riding. You're observing, memorizing landmarks, noting the subtle shifts in terrain, and constantly calculating the distance to your next potential stop. Imagine trying to navigate without a map, relying only on whispered directions from the last settler, a faded blaze on a tree, or the faint hint of a deer trail. It's like playing a real-life, slow-motion video game where the stakes are getting lost and sleeping hungry in the rain. A typical day on the trail began before dawn. You'd wake with the first hint of light, the air often crisp and cold, perhaps a thin layer of dew clinging to everything. After a quick, likely cold breakfast, maybe a piece of hardtack or dried venison, washed down with creek water, you'd saddle your horse. This wasn't a quick hop-on. It was a ritual of checking the tack, making sure your few possessions were secure, and whispering a quiet prayer for safe passage. Then you'd begin. The silence of the early morning would be broken only by the rhythmic thud of your horse's hooves and the chirping of unseen birds. You'd ride for hours, the miles slowly ticking by, marked not by signposts, but by the gradual change in the sunlight filtering through the trees, or the sound of a distant river growing louder. You quickly learn to appreciate the small comforts. A patch of dry ground for a brief rest, the unexpected sweetness of wild berries, or the shade of an ancient oak on a hot afternoon. The challenges were numerous and varied. Swollen rivers, sudden thunderstorms, and impassable thickets were common roadblocks. You might spend an hour trying to find a safe ford across a churning river, or be forced to detour miles around a fallen tree that blocked your path. Then there were the more insidious challenges, like the gnawing loneliness that would set in after days without human interaction, or the constant fear of losing your way in an unfamiliar wilderness. You'd become acutely aware of every rustle in the undergrowth, every snap of a twig, your senses heightened by the constant need for vigilance. And of course, there were the insects. Clouds of mosquitoes in humid lowlands, relentless flies, and ticks that seemed to materialize from thin air. It makes you almost miss modern-day traffic jams, doesn't it? At least with traffic, you can usually count on getting to a bathroom. Yet, amidst these hardships, there were also simple joys. The breathtaking beauty of an untouched landscape, a sunset painting the sky in fiery hues over a vast prairie, or the sudden, exhilarating sight of a deer bounding through the woods. You might stumble upon a hidden waterfall, its gentle roar a soothing balm after hours of silence. Or perhaps, most profoundly, the quiet companionship of your horse, a creature as dedicated to the journey as you were. This animal wasn't just transportation. It was a partner, a confidant, and often your only steady presence. You'd learn its moods, its preferences, and rely implicitly on its sure-footedness. This relationship, though unspoken, was a vital source of comfort. Historians still debate the true extent to which these horses were considered partners versus merely transport. But for the solitary rider, the distinction often blurred into quiet devotion. It was a life of constant motion, a quiet pilgrimage through a wild, evolving nation, powered by faith and the steady beat of hooves on earth. As you continue your slow, rhythmic journey through the untamed expanses, it's not all serene sunsets and quiet introspection. The frontier was a place of opportunity, yes, but also a crucible of unexpected dangers, some mundane, some truly menacing. You're not just a solitary traveler. You're a man of the cloth, often carrying not just spiritual guidance, but sometimes money or news, making you a potential target. Every rustle in the undergrowth could be a deer, or it could be something far less benign. Wildlife, for instance, wasn't just picturesque. It was a genuine threat. Bears, wolves, and even wildcats roamed these lands. Imagine pitching your meager camp at dusk, the smell of your small cooking fire drifting on the breeze, only to hear the low growl of a bear somewhere beyond the flickering light. You'd quickly learn the importance of securing your food, keeping a watchful eye, and perhaps even sleeping with an axe or a sturdy stick within reach. It's not quite the glamping experience you see advertised today, is it? More like roughing it with teeth. Beyond the tooth and claw threats, there are also the less dramatic, but equally debilitating, dangers of illness. Without modern medicine, a simple cut could fester, a fever could turn deadly, and dysentery from contaminated water was a constant, unpleasant companion. You'd learn to recognize medicinal plants, or at least know which local settler might have a folk remedy to try. Then there were the human elements. While many frontier settlers were welcoming and devout, the wilderness also attracted its share of outlaws, desperate individuals, and those who simply preferred to live beyond the reach of established law. You might encounter lone drifters, suspicious characters lurking on the fringes of newly formed settlements, or even organized banditry in less populated areas. Your only defense was often your wits, your reputation as a man of peace, and perhaps the unappealing prospect of robbing a humble preacher who possesses only a worn Bible and a weary horse. Historians continue to debate the true prevalence of banditry, specifically targeting circuit riders. But accounts suggest that vigilance was always a necessity. It was a strange dichotomy. You were bringing salvation, but also inadvertently putting yourself in harm's way simply by traversing these often lawless stretches. However, not all encounters were grim. Sometimes the unexpected encounter was a welcome one. You might stumble upon a small, isolated homestead, miles from anywhere, and be met with overwhelming hospitality from a family desperate for news from the outside world and a fresh face. These were often the moments that recharged your spirit. A warm meal, a comfortable bed, and the chance to share stories and laughter around a crackling fire. These brief periods of fellowship were the antithesis of the solitude, a reminder of the very human connection you are riding so far to provide. You'd exchange news of crops, births, and deaths, and in return, offer comfort and a sense of enduring faith. These were the peculiar perks of the job, the little oases of human kindness in a vast, indifferent world. It truly makes you appreciate the convenience of modern communication, doesn't it? A quick video call beats days of lonely riding any time. Having traversed the dusty, sometimes dangerous trails, you finally arrive at your destination, often a small cluster of cabins or a single isolated homestead. And here, your true work begins, delivering the sermon. Forget grand cathedrals with stained glass and pipe organs. Your church is often the humble home of a settler family, a cleared patch of forest, or perhaps a rough-hewn barn. Imagine the scene: candles flickering, casting dancing shadows on rough-hewn walls, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. Settlers, some having traveled hours on foot or by horse, would gather, their faces eager, tired, and deeply hopeful. They might be sitting on crude benches, logs, or simply standing, packed together, a rare moment of community in their isolated lives. Your sermon wouldn't be a lofty academic lecture. It had to be immediate, relatable, and deeply resonant with the struggles and hopes of these frontier people. You'd speak of resilience, of perseverance, of faith in the face of hardship, themes they understood intimately. There was no time for theological esoterica. It was about connecting heart to heart with people who might not see another preacher for months. You'd use vivid imagery drawn from their own lives, the sowing of seeds, the changing seasons, the strength of an ox. And you'd have to be flexible. Perhaps a baby would cry, a dog would wander in, or a sudden downpour would drum loudly on the roof. These were not distractions. They were simply part of the lived experience, woven into the fabric of the gathering. It's a far cry from the perfectly climate-controlled, sound-buffered auditoriums we're used to today, isn't it? No sound engineer to fix your mic levels here, just the natural acoustics of a log cabin. The music, if there was any, was often unaccompanied, a chorus of voices rising in simple, heartfelt hymns. These weren't polished performances. They were raw expressions of faith, sometimes sung off-key, but always with profound sincerity. Picture the flickering light, the tired but earnest faces, and the collective voice filling the small space. A moment of shared transcendence. After the sermon, there might be baptisms in a nearby creek, simple communion with unleavened bread and water, and often marriages. These were vital life events, often postponed until a circuit rider arrived, making you not just a spiritual guide, but also a vital civil servant. You were bringing sacraments and ceremonies to people who had little access to such official rites. One fascinating, quirky tidbit about these gatherings is how quickly news spread through them. While the sermon was the main event, the gathering itself was a rare opportunity for these isolated families to exchange information, share stories, and simply catch up. You, the circuit rider, were often the most consistent source of outside news, having just traveled from another settlement, bringing tales of happenings both grand and mundane from miles away. Historians still debate the extent to which these religious gatherings also served as crucial, informal news networks, but it's clear they were vital social hubs. It was like a slow-motion, analog internet, powered by horse and hymn. These moments, under the moonlight or the dim glow of lanterns, solidified communities and offered a profound sense of hope in a challenging world. After the heartfelt sermons and the community gatherings, the practicalities of frontier life came sharply into focus: food and lodging. For you, the circuit rider, there was no guaranteed hotel reservation or even a simple inn. Your sustenance and shelter relied almost entirely on the hospitality of the very people you served. Imagine knocking on the door of a crude log cabin, often after dark, unsure if you'd be met with a welcoming smile or a wary glance. Thankfully, more often than not, it was the former. The unwritten code of the frontier dictated that a traveler, especially a man of God, was offered what little the family had. So, what did this hospitality look like? Food was often simple but nourishing. You might be offered corn pone, perhaps some stew made from whatever game was plentiful, or freshly baked bread. These were not elaborate feasts. They were meals born of necessity and generosity. You'd eat alongside the family, sharing stories and quiet conversation around a rough-hewn table. It was a stark contrast to the lonely, meager meals you'd often eat on the trail. And remember that sense of gnawing loneliness we talked about earlier? These shared meals were a powerful antidote, a reminder that you were part of a larger, interconnected human tapestry, even in the vast wilderness. You'd learn about their struggles and triumphs, their hopes and fears, becoming intimately familiar with the fabric of their lives. It's safe to say these weren't five-star dining experiences, but they certainly packed more flavor than any bland airline meal. Lodging varied wildly. Some nights, you might find yourself in a genuine bed, a rare luxury that felt like sleeping on a cloud. More often, you'd be offered a pallet on the floor near the fireplace, the warmth a welcome comfort against the night's chill. Sometimes, if the cabin was particularly small or crowded, you might even sleep in the barn, nestled amongst the hay, listening to the soft sounds of livestock. It wasn't always glamorous, but it was shelter from the elements, a momentary reprieve from the relentless exposure of the trail. The important thing was the spirit in which it was offered, a selfless act of kindness that transcended class or comfort. Historians still argue about the exact proportion of nights spent in homes versus rough camping, but it's clear that both were integral parts of the circuit rider's existence. These interactions were more than just about receiving food and shelter. They were crucial for building trust and community. As a circuit rider, you weren't just passing through. You were becoming a temporary, yet vital, member of each family and settlement you visited. You listened to their troubles, offered counsel, and celebrated their joys. You might help with chores, mend a fence, or assist with a sick child. This willingness to share in their daily lives, to truly connect on a human level, built bonds that extended far beyond the Sunday sermon. These moments of fellowship fostered a profound sense of mutual respect and dependence, creating a network of support that sustained both the settlers and you, the weary traveler. It's a wonderful reminder that true connection often happens over the simplest of shared experiences, like a warm bowl of stew after a long day's ride. Beyond the solemn duty of delivering sermons and conducting baptisms, your role as an early American circuit rider extended far beyond the pulpit. You weren't just a spiritual guide. You were a vital artery of information, a community builder, and sometimes even an impromptu doctor or lawyer. In the vast, sparsely settled frontier, specialized professionals were practically non-existent. So, when you rode into a settlement, you became, by necessity, a multi-tool of human assistance. Think about it. Who else was consistently traversing these isolated paths? Very few. So you became the frontier's postal service. Settlers would press letters into your hand, often to be delivered to a relative miles away on your route, or to a distant town where they hoped to find a market for their furs or crops. You carried messages of births and deaths, of marriages and misfortunes, bridging the vast distances that separated families and neighbors. Imagine being the bearer of longed-for news, good or bad, knowing that the words you carried might be the first and only communication someone receives for months. It was a weighty responsibility, yet one you accepted as part of your calling. It's a bit like being a human email service, but with significantly longer delivery times and a much higher chance of being eaten by a bear. You also served as an informal advisor and mediator. Disputes among neighbors, questions about land claims, even marital disagreements. These often found their way to your ears. With no formal legal system immediately available, you, as a trusted, educated figure, were often called upon to offer counsel, to interpret a law you'd heard about in a more established town, or simply to mediate a quarrel with a calm, unbiased voice. Your authority came not from a badge or a gavel, but from the respect you commanded as a man of principle. This unexpected legal and social role highlights how deeply intertwined the spiritual and practical aspects of frontier life truly were. Historians still debate the precise impact of circuit riders on early frontier legal practices, but their role in maintaining social order cannot be understated. Furthermore, you often possessed a rudimentary knowledge of medicine and healing. Having spent so much time exposed to the elements and learning from various communities, you pick up on folk remedies, basic first aid, and perhaps even carry a small supply of herbs or simple medicines. When sickness struck an isolated family, you might be the only one passing through with any medical insight whatsoever. You'd treat a fever, clean a wound, or offer what comfort you could. This wasn't professional medical care, of course, but in a desperate time, it was often all that was available. You truly were a jack of all trades, a wandering beacon of practical assistance in a world that sorely needed it. This blend of spiritual, social, and practical duties made the circuit rider an indispensable figure, weaving together the scattered threads of frontier society into something resembling a coherent community. As the 19th century progressed, the wild frontier you knew so intimately began to recede. The mild adventures of the early American circuit rider, while still challenging, slowly transformed, and eventually, the era of the itinerant preacher began to fade. The forces that brought about this change were subtle at first, and gathered momentum like a slow-moving river becoming a torrent. One of the most significant factors was the steady march of westward expansion and settlement. As more people moved into the wilderness, What were once isolated homesteads slowly grew into hamlets and villages and eventually towns. With more concentrated populations came the ability to establish permanent churches. These fixed structures, with their dedicated ministers and regular congregations, began to fill the spiritual void that the circuit riders had initially addressed. Imagine, after years of holding services in barns and cabins, the joy and perhaps a touch of wistfulness of seeing a proper church steeple rise against the horizon. This wasn't a sudden overnight shift, but a gradual process, community by community, as the wild spaces became more domesticated. The development of infrastructure also played a crucial role. Roads, however rudimentary, slowly improved, making travel less arduous and more predictable. Steamboats navigated rivers, and later, railroads began to snake their way across the continent. These transportation networks allowed for faster, more efficient movement of goods, people, and significantly, established clergy. No longer was a horse and a strong constitution the only way to reach distant parishioners. This made the circuit rider's unique, often solitary, mode of travel less essential. It's like comparing a modern-day express delivery service to someone walking across the country with a backpack. Both get the job done, but one is clearly more efficient for a growing population. Furthermore, denominational structures matured and adapted. As Methodist and other frontier denominations grew, they became more organized, able to support a larger number of stationary ministers and build more churches. The very success of the circuit rider movement in spreading faith and building communities ultimately led to its own transformation. Their pioneering efforts laid the groundwork for the very institutions that would, in time, render their unique form of ministry less necessary. Historians still argue about the exact tipping point when the number of settled churches began to significantly outnumber circuit routes, but the trend was undeniable. Yet even as their numbers dwindled and their specific role evolved, the legacy of the early American circuit rider endures. They were the spiritual trailblazers, the quiet heroes who braved isolation and danger to bring hope, community, and a sense of shared purpose to a developing nation. They embodied resilience, selflessness, and an unwavering commitment to their calling. Many of the permanent churches and communities that dot the American landscape today owe their very existence to the tireless efforts of these solitary figures. You can almost feel their presence, a lingering echo in the gentle whisper of the wind through the tall grass, a reminder of the quiet, determined souls who rode into the wild, bringing light to the darkness. Their journey wasn't always grand or dramatic, but it was profoundly impactful, laying down the spiritual roots of a nation, one quiet ride, one heartfelt sermon at a time. Now, as the long shadows of history stretch out behind us, and the image of that lone rider fades into the twilight, you can feel the quiet settle over you. The sounds of the wilderness soften. The distant calls of unseen creatures become whispers, and the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves slowly, gently, begins to recede. Imagine the calm stillness of a frontier night, the stars appearing one by one in the inky sky, offering a silent, unwavering light. Let the slow, peaceful cadence of that journey, the quiet determination of those who rode through hardship, lull your own thoughts into a gentle calm. Feel the soft rustle of leaves, the distant murmur of a sleepy creek, and the quiet assurance that, even in the most sprawling and untamed landscapes, there were always those who brought connection, comfort, and a soothing sense of peace. Allow yourself to drift, carried by the quiet echoes of a bygone era, into a soft and restful slumber.